welcome to the webinar on realigning buildings with nature. We had over almost 300 registrations, so I'm super excited that so many people have registered. My name is Marc Sherratt, and I'm going to be your facilitator today. I'm a Living Future ambassador, and in my daily life, I run Solid Green Consulting, and I'm also a director of Greenet. A very warm welcome to our regulars, and also a very warm welcome to all the people for whom this is the first webinar. We hope we can capture your interest and hope you will keep on following our webinars and our work that we're doing as the Living Future Collaborative of South Africa. If this event is interesting to you, and please also have a look at our previous events. This is the 7th event that we've been doing. So if you're interested in any of these topics that are on the slide, just go to our website, on the Greenet website, and all these courses are available for CPD points for the coming 12 months. So have a look, and we hope we can capture your interest. So first of all, I'd really like to thank our sponsor for today, which is EcoSolv, and it's a South African company distributing agricultural products and technology from the US. Their aim is to enhance the sustainability and regeneration of agricultural landscapes in South Africa and Africa. They are bringing solutions to some of the challenges we are facing as a very water-sensitive country and looking at biomimicry to design some of these solutions. They are providing technologies to assist farmers in South Africa to assist with reducing their levels of water, fertilizer, and energy consumption by 20 to 25%. While conditioning their soil and growing healthier and more vigorous crops. Their water-enhancing technology has been on the market for 10 years, and all their products were tested globally over a 3-year period. EcoSolv has proven success stories from farmers who have farmed with significant savings of water, electricity, and labor, and farmers have also reported increasing yields, healthier and more vigorous yields. Who is the Living Building Challenge? Who is the Living Future Collaborative of South Africa, and here's the International Living Institute, and why are we doing all this work? The Living Future Collaborative South Africa is a organization or is a group of volunteers who are wanting to spread the word of the International Living Future Institute. And the Living Future Institute is based in America, and their vision is really about building a world that's socially just, culturally rich, and ecologically restorative. Working towards this mission, they've come up with a couple of programs that they are bringing into our industry, which is called the Living Building Challenge, Living Community Challenge, Living Product Challenge, and also some other slightly less stringent certification schemes, such as the carbon certification, zero energy certification, and the core green building certification. They also have a couple of transparency labels, as in Declare, Just, and Reveal. From the International Living Future Institute, they have a Living Future network, which we are part of. So the collaborative does events, we're bringing advocacy, we're trying to organize education around living buildings, and we're trying to create awareness. We're also trying to support the Living Future Accredited Professional, and we currently have 4 in South Africa, which is me, Tulani, Audrey, and Michelle. Well, we're hoping to encourage a couple more people to take the accreditation as well, or to learn for the accreditation. Where does this all come from? I'm going to give you a short introduction into very short Living Building Challenge, just to place this whole webinar into context. Living Building Challenge is one of the certification programs of the ILFI, and it's really taking sustainable buildings to the next level. Creating regenerative buildings, buildings that do more good to the environment as opposed to less bad to the environment. So this graph shows you that we're going over and beyond, mitigating the negative impacts, and whereas we're trying to focus on creating a positive impact with our buildings through the Living Building Challenge. The Living Building Challenge, as their logo, a flower, and it's a metaphor for what they're intending to do. With a flower, it's rooted in its place, and yet it harvests all its energy and water from their surroundings. It's adapted completely to the climate and the site it's located in, it operates pollution-free, and it's comprised of integrated systems. And above all that, it's beautiful. And this is what we're trying to simulate in the buildings. So buildings that can produce, harvest their water energy from the environment and be totally positive to the environment. So being net positive energy, being net positive water, and doing no harm to the environment. So we do presentations on more detailed into this Living Building Challenge system. So just keep in touch with us and we'll notify you around those presentations. I'm a bit calling it a certification system, but it's actually more a philosophy, advocacy, and certification system. Lastly, it's a holistic system, so it's not like most green building certification systems where you can pick and choose your initiatives and your greening options. In this system, you have to meet all requirements that are there. So all requirements are mandatory. It's measured on outcomes. So most projects or certification only happens 12 months after operation. So after you've actually demonstrated that you've designed, built, and operating it in accordance with the requirements of the Living Building Challenge. And as part of doing the Living Building Challenge, there's a lot of advocacy that needs to go because some of these things are going against some of the regulations that's currently in place. And then you have to, demonstrate that you've done a lot of advocacy and interaction and communications with the institution that prohibit you from doing certain things of the challenge. And by that, creating positive change within the legislation environment. And the whole system is also evolving over time based on experiences of projects in different countries and different contexts. So there's different levels of certification, and I'm not going to dive into detail here. We'll do that in one of the introductions to the Living Building Challenge, but you can clearly see like the highest level of achievement that you can do is like a full living building certification, and you have to meet all the requirements that are outlined there. You can do petal certification, which then limits a number of imperatives to 3 core imperatives and some others. And you can do a core certification and zero energy and zero carbon. So you can sort of see how it steps up. Within the Living Building Challenge, there are 7 petals, and petals referring back to the flower. And today we are going to look in detail into the place petal. So we're not going to talk about energy, water, health and happiness, materials, equity and beauty, but today we're looking at the place petal specifically. And if you're interested in any of the other petals, we have done an energy webinar, we've done a water webinar, so those are all available. They're recorded. You can look at the videos on our website. But for today, we're going to look at the place petal. And the intent of the place petal is to restore a healthy relationship between nature, place, and community. And within this place petal, there's 4 imperatives. The first one is Ecology of Place. And the intent of this imperative is to protect wild and ecologically significant places and encourage ecological regeneration and enhanced function of the communities and places where these projects are built. So requirements for these imperatives are evaluated on a performance-based approach. So project teams must focus on making the site better, both from an ecological point of view, but also from a social community point of view. Landscapes must, for example, be designed to completely emulate functionality of the project's reference habitat, so previous habitats or the habitats that it's located in. And projects must also involve an assessment of the social and cultural equity factors in order to inform the design. So you will look at what's happening with the community around your site, what social issues are around your site, and how those issues or challenges or opportunities can actually feed back into design. And we will have a speaker, Marc, who will go and dive a little bit more into this imperative, or we'll talk about ecology of place. The second imperative is urban agriculture. And the intent of this imperative is to integrate opportunities for connecting the community to grow locally fresh food. And project teams must either provide space for growing food on site or provide a space for storing and distributing local grown food. Our second speaker is going to dive into urban agriculture and is going to show you how this can be practically implemented on some of the built environment projects. Then there's a third imperative, which is habitat exchange. And the intent of this imperative is to protect land for other species, as we're taking more and more land for our human use. So as part of this imperative, project teams must donate an equivalent amount of land to an approved land trust, so that that land trust can then improve certain lands and to create the original habitat and protect the ecological sensitive site. And the last imperative is human-scaled living, and this is really around creation of walkable, pedestrian-orientated communities that reduce the use of fossil fuel vehicles. So today we're deep diving in two of these imperatives, ecology of place and urban agriculture. But before we're doing that, I just want to make this statement that it's time to create a living future and a world full of living buildings. And if you want to know more about living buildings, introduction into the Living Building Challenge, you can contact us and we can do a presentation specifically for you if you have a group of 10 or more people. One of the LFAs in South Africa will come and do a presentation for you, which is CPD validated, so you can get CPD points as well. If you want to book it, just contact us. We'll provide you our email address a bit later. So diving into the speakers, first up is Marc Sherratt. And Marc was recently chosen by the Mail and Guardian as one of the South African pioneers in the green economy. He has designed some of the most progressive green buildings in the country and is running his own architectural practice, focusing on contemporary African architecture at the highest sustainability standards. His team was the first to design a triple net zero project on the African continent, and I'm very proud to say we were part of that team as the sustainability consultant, so that was a really fun project. And second up, we have Brendon Martens, who will focus on urban agriculture. And Brendon is a development economist and is running a specialist consulting firm that supports the development and implementation of innovative models around urban agriculture, youth development, and small business development and utility scale economic development. Recently, his work focused on revitalizing a failing urban agricultural program in Johannesburg by developing a new theory of change and program, while also being asked and tasked to implement this actual approach. So, which I'm sure this experience he's going to share with us today. So I am going to stop sharing my screen and hand over to Marc.
Thanks for that kind introduction. Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for joining us. I'm going to be taking you through the ecology of place imperative of the Living Building Challenge. Let's just start with a bit of definitions. It just helps us in a world where sustainability now is meaning a million things. So defining sustainability, we see it as humankind's responsibility to live within a regenerated ecological capacity. We'll go into what that actually means. And that's balanced with social equity. So it's important not to see those two things as separate, but as one thing. Maurice has really touched on the aim of the ecology of place, but as you've heard, its imperative is to protect wild and ecologically significant places and encourage ecological regeneration. So maybe let me just separate two terms from the beginning. Ecological restoration is when you're looking back at a historical landscape and trying to bring that back. Ecological regeneration is when it's actually not possible practically to bring that landscape back. And so you need to choose a different kind of habitat in order to contrast that to something still as biodiverse as that previous habitat. And then we as a firm, I just put our mission statement in here, reversing local extinction through sustainable architecture. We really are incredibly passionate about the ecological side. We really see it as the base starting point when it comes to sustainability. All right, so let's define what does it mean to live within the ecological capacity of the planet. This has probably been the best model that I've seen recently. It's called the donut model. It's developed by an economist called Kate Raworth. She basically put together the ecological ceiling of the planet. So if you look at the big green outer ring, that's 9 categories of the planet that we need to live within. Anything that's bright red means we've crossed over that ecological threshold. So it might be overwhelming for you if you're watching the news or whatever. Where do we actually start with sustainability? This actually gives you quite an easy to understand graphic to say it's these 4 key areas: biodiversity loss, land conversion, climate change, and basically fertilizer loading in agriculture, that we have actually crossed the ceiling. What's interesting about Kate's work is she's balanced the ecological ceiling with social foundation, that she says at the same time of solving these ecological ceiling aspects, we have to be building a social foundation throughout the planet related to food. You can see food is basically the worst one, but all these other aspects in order for us to live in a functional world. What does that mean for South Africa? So this is out of the greenhouse gas inventory report, which basically takes a look at our greenhouse gas emissions over the last kind of 15 years. And if you look at 0, the graph, everything below the line are things that are absorbing carbon dioxide or carbon dioxide equivalent gases, greenhouse gases. So these are good things. These are things we should be protecting and growing. As you can see, the blue is forestry and the gray is grassland. So these are 2 large-scale carbon sinks that are actually absorbing carbon dioxide within our environment. This gives us a really positive reason to protect our indigenous systems. Most indigenous systems are high carbon systems, and the health of those systems actually encourages removal of carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. If you look at specifically the South African context, the landscapes that are the most endangered, Indian coastal belt, forest, grassland, top 3 are those landscapes that are actually absorbing the most CO2 for us. So it's kind of a no-brainer. When we're approaching ecological systems, for us to restore indigenous systems is the starting point in terms of us fighting climate change as large-scale carbon sinks. Graphs are wonderful, but you only really start to believe this stuff when you get on the ground. So we, as a practice in the early days, kind of traveled all over the country, all over Southern Africa, actually, researching these landscapes and seeing for ourselves the climate change that's already happening on the ground. We've been in places from the Okavango in Botswana. This is the Namib Desert in Namibia. And we've seen this fundamental shift in landscape change, which is really quite scary. Almost about 3/4 of South Africa is grassland. And this is kind of the Wakkerstroom area. It's a famous area within South Africa in terms of grassland species, endangered species, in terms of bird life. And it's projected in the next 20 years to be changing to savanna. Things like the Karoo are going to become desert. That's really the projections from the South African National Biodiversity Institute. So that's just a bit of global and regional background around why it's important to focus on something like ecology. So let's dive specifically into the Ecology of Place imperative. So I want to contrast, I know there's probably some green building accredited professionals in the room. So I just want to contrast 2 tools that are locally available within South Africa. You've got the Green Building Council of South Africa's net positive ecology rating, which looks at ecological regeneration. And then you've got what we're speaking about today, the Living Building Challenge. And what's important to note is the differences I've stated at the bottom. The net positive ecology rating from the Green Building Council basically looks at increasing the ecological value of a site, so increasing indigenous species or endemic species from a specific area compared to its existing condition. So it's really about, if you've got a parking lot or an exotic garden, increasing that with indigenous vegetation. It's not really that hard to do. And the Living Building Challenge Ecology of Place is a project must demonstrate ecological regeneration compared to an appropriate reference habitat. So this is about setting an objective standard that you then compare your ecological regeneration to. And as Marius has mentioned, this is judged over a 12-month process after your project has been complete. So how do we do this? This is just a summarized way in terms of achieving ecology of place. Step 1 is to first identify a reference habitat. What is that for your specific site? Again, it might not be the historical landscape. Step 2, assess a baseline ecological condition, which I'll walk you through. Step 3 is generate an adaptive plan. So how do we kind of start this process of ecological improvement? And then step 4, how do you monitor and maintain that plan over a 12-month period? So what the Ecology of Place imperative has produced is this recovery wheel. So you start with a baseline habitat, which is looking at the 6 categories. I won't go into detail of all of them, but basically rating how biodiverse the site is. Are there invasive species? What's the trophic levels like? What's the hydrology like? What's the soil conditions like? Rating that as a baseline. And then you go to the other extreme about saying, what is your restoration goal? What would you like this project to aim at in the long term? Then, obviously, between that, you've got your 12-month progress, which you'll submit as part of your submission in order to get accreditation. This method was developed by the Society of Ecological Regeneration. It's called the 5-star method, and it's probably the most holistic method when you look at ecosystem functionality. I can send this to you if you guys want this in a little bit more detail, but I won't bore you with all the kind of going into each specific category. And so how do we apply this in the city scale? So, if we're looking at a place, obviously this was developed in the States. What does this really mean for the African context, for the South African context, for the Johannesburg context? We felt as a firm there's kind of this research gap missing in terms of the city of Joburg and what that really means as, what is the reference habitat? What does it actually mean to restore the city? And so we've begun a publication called Extinct Johannesburg, Ecologically Regenerating a City. And I've started to unpack for people kind of where did the city come from and how do we start to mine the inspiration of the city's past in order to develop relevant architecture. So as we know, Johannesburg is a pretty young city founded on gold. There's an argument that if gold wasn't discovered here, there probably wouldn't be a city here. Most of the kind of early settlers moved past Johannesburg into places like Pretoria that was founded much before Johannesburg. And that's really because the landscape is pretty inhospitable. You've got cold, icy winters. It's a grassland habitat, so you can imagine traveling through here full of predators, not that hospitable to human habitation. And so without gold, this relatively young city probably wouldn't have been here. Again, Highveld grassland is quite an amazing ecological system, being incredibly diverse. In terms of an architectural practice, we kind of look at 3 key areas when we're designing a project. Number one is the history of a place, both the social, cultural, and environmental history. We look at the ecology and we look at the people. And when you tie these 3 things together, you get a successful building. We've started to argue around increasing the client base of architecture to include things like threatened species. As cities are growing, we're finding that just the space constraints of what threatened species have to function in just isn't enough anymore. And so cities have to start relooking at who are their equal citizens, really, and can that include things like threatened species. Looking at the grassland biome in its extent, you can see Johannesburg kind of sits on the edge between grassland and bushveld, or what's called savanna in the European sense. So the Magaliesberg mountain range, if you're familiar with Johannesburg and the Gauteng area, is basically the dividing point between those 2 biomes. And as you can see, the grassland biome has a significant area within the country that is grassland, going all the way through to Lesotho. And just to give you those climate change projections, basically what they're saying is Lesotho will probably be the only place that has grassland in it in the next 20 years due to climate change. Everything else that you see here is going to be changing to savanna. So that's quite scary in terms of threatened species, which some of them are kind of unique to this area and nowhere else in the world. Grasslands are also phenomenal when it comes to climate resilience aspect. Being a lighter color, they reflect heat back into the atmosphere. They don't absorb heat, which is great. They absorb carbon into their soils. So obviously, most of our staple foods come from grasses, things like rice or sorghum or maize. And that's because the soils of grasslands are the most fertile in the world. And that's really because of this carbon and nitrogen cycle that gets just massive fertilization over the years. The Gauteng province, as we know, the most populated area in the country, really kind of the beating heart. And so we've got a real opportunity as a city and as a community to demonstrate ecological restoration for the rest of the continent. If we can do it in Johannesburg, that was based on mining and based in kind of large scale industrial, destruction of the environment, we can do it anywhere. Again, just to give you context, if those aren't familiar about Johannesburg, this map basically shows your large-scale water reservoirs. Most of our fresh water comes from the Vaal system at the bottom here. We pump it up quite high to where the Johannesburg city municipality is, which is the grey area. And then you've got your major geological features, things like the Magaliesberg mountain range up here. This is Pilanesberg Game Reserve, and you've got Frederick Dome at the bottom. So let's just jump into some of the research that we've been producing that you might find interesting in terms of where the cities come from. So Johannesburg, you can't really understand Johannesburg without understanding its geological formations. So if we think back kind of 3 billion years ago, this area was covered by a large inland sea. There was algae within that sea that actually created our atmosphere. There's still kind of proof of that within the rocks around the Johannesburg region. Then there was a mass outpouring of basaltic lava, and that created things like the Magaliesberg mountain range. And then there was a massive meteorite impact, the Frederick Dome, which some of you know as a World Heritage Site, that generated a huge explosion. So let me just get the statistics right. It generated a 300-kilometer crater. So if this is a two-scale drawing, we see the size of Johannesburg municipal region. So you've got kind of the edges of the region going within the city of this impact, which is quite amazing. And then the other World Heritage aspect, as we know, is the cradle of humankind, where we've really, it's been linked obviously to Taung, where near Kimberley, where the first hominid was found that actually opened up the argument for the first time that that humans actually evolved within the African condition. Johannesburg's had years and years of settlement, going from kind of 10,000, 20,000 years of Stone Age all the way to Tswana Iron Age settlement that included things like the Ndebele invasion of kind of the 1800s with Mzilikazi, which I'm sure you're familiar with. And so you have this kind of settlement generally around koppies and around mountain ranges, as you can see, linked to the geological formation. And then obviously after that, the Afrikaners conquered the Ndebele, and the British conquered the Afrikaners and then formed the Union of South Africa. And, fast forward all the way through to now, we now have a democratic society where actually all people are free to vote and free to participate in this incredible city. But it's important to note that Johannesburg does have a history before the city came. Then, obviously, as we know, Johannesburg was founded on mining. Many people don't know that kind of it's the land that didn't have gold that has become the most significant. So the city was founded in a triangular piece of land where you can actually still see that within the urban grain of the city today. If you connect Diagonal Street, Commissioner, and N Street in the inner city, you can see that triangle. And that's where no gold was yielded. Interestingly, the only other place that didn't yield any gold was Melville Koppies, and that's why that is a nature reserve today and still standing, because people thought there was gold, but there wasn't gold. And as you can see, the mining belt within Johannesburg has this kind of east-west axis, quite significant. It's the richest gold fields in the world. And massive urban development has developed around that, where we are really sitting with kind of one holistic city region. If you combine Pretoria, obviously, now called Tshwane, and the rest of the urban fabric, we are kind of, functioning as one large city region. Mining is still really important for the area. On the other side of the Magaliesberg mountain range, you've got some of the largest platinum and iron ore deposits in the world. So mining is still important to our economy and to this region in general. And another interesting aspect around Johannesburg is the continental watershed kind of moves directly through it. That's that red line. And so what does that mean? That means that every drop of rain that falls on the north of this goes to the Indian Ocean. Everything that falls to the south goes to the Atlantic. So there is a direct responsibility of the city to think about its water reservoir systems and how do we kind of almost give the water back cleaner than we took it. Obviously, the opposite is happening of that today. This is just some interest in terms of the largest man-made forest in the world, which is what Johannesburg's afforestation has been credited. Afforestation basically means that you plant a forest where there wasn't a forest before. And as you can see, the size of it within the Johannesburg municipal area is huge. So you're talking about 400 square kilometers of a heavily treed area. And again, we're working with the city to try and integrate that into its climate resilient plans, and also as kind of an indigenous historical habitat reference, which you'll see just now. Another aspect of Johannesburg is its critical biodiversity areas. So these are areas mainly that are this original grassland habitat, which I spoke about, that is one of our most endangered landscapes in the country, and how we actually link these two very different landscapes together. As you know, things like small spotted gennet have started coming back into the city because of its forestation. So how do we build our systems together to try and increase wildlife, obviously protected, but at the same time having an amazing space in which we can thrive? All right. So what does this actually mean here? These two landscapes together, as you can see them, this is a photo on Malva Koppies, which is one of the few grassland areas remaining in the city. And as you can see, our beautiful forest area, which has been quite an incredible climate device that we've used as a city. So generally, if you compare it to surrounding farmlands, we probably have about a 4-degree warmer temperature in winter than if we didn't have any trees. So trees were initially planted obviously because of lumber, but also to stop wind and things like the mine dumps and their kind of pollution aspect getting driven into the city. And so trees have become really important in Johannesburg, both as kind of a climate adaptation device, but also in terms of purifying air. In terms of our projections for climate change as a city, we're talking about a 2-degree warmer environment on average per year by 2050, and a 20 millimeter less rainfall by 2050. So not extensive. There's some areas that are much hotter and get much less or more rain than us, but still significant. So this is just a 4-part series of what we've produced for the city of Joburg in terms of a city regeneration plan. We speak about visually highlighting the continental watershed as a pedestrian and transportation route across the city. Then the yellow part is restoring the mine dumps to appropriate reference habitat. The second goal is looking at restoring north flowing river systems. Those are the major river systems that flow through the city of Joburg, and we've got projects that are working with the city in terms of doing that. Goal 3 is looking at afforesting southern suburbs like Soweto, and then linking these critical biodiversity areas with wildlife corridors. So that's kind of our general plan that we just wanted to share with you, just so you know what's happening at a bigger scale. And now we're just going to share pretty quickly just 3 practical projects that we've taken this kind of ecology of place approach into solving real life architectural problems. And I'm just going to skim through these projects. This is a current work that we're doing in Alexandra Township. And basically, we know there's a massive problem with informal settlement. Our cities are growing very, very quickly. Johannesburg is projected to grow at 3 people an hour by 2025. So we're basically not building housing fast enough with our conventional means. And something like fire, as we know, is an incredibly difficult problem to solve when there's been no infrastructure laid out from the beginning. But again, you can look at your original reference habitat as inspiration. This is looking at grassland, and that's what we did. We studied grassland plant species that are specifically adapted to fire. This is the high-file protea or Protea caphra that we translated their design principles biomimetically into the architectural design. This is specifically where the housing unit is placed, pretty close to Nelson Mandela's house. It's built out of cross-laminated timber or CLT that has very good fire-resistant rating. And we started to build an ecological system around the unit itself, using apiculture, indigenous fruiting trees like Stamfrucht milkplum, creating, apiculture is basically the harvesting of bees, so creating a pollinating ecosystem around that with things like wild jasmine, and creating a microeconomy around the unit that actually can be used to create economic security for the person that lives within it. So this is the fire repulsion system of the system. So again, it protects itself from fire, specifically like that plant-specific species, the high-file protea. Another project, the Flayers residential development. So this is this triple net zero development that Marlies mentioned. Again, what we did was go back to the original landscapes of Johannesburg. There's 3, it's Koppie, grassland, and wetland. And wetland became the most appropriate for us to use on our site. Wetlands are also climate resilient in the Johannesburg context because they give a 2-degree reduction in air temperature. And if you remember, our projection is a 2-degree increase. So you can use landscapes as an initial design approach also in terms of climate resilience. So our architectural idea became architecture as nest, similar to how a bird's nest camouflages, uses local materials, other things when it does build its nest within a specific environment. And this is a triple net zero accredited project. What does that mean? Basically, it means net zero carbon is you don't need a municipal connection. Everything's on renewables. Everything that you use is on a renewable system, obviously after being efficient first. It's net zero water. So basically our wetland system harvests all our rainwater, and we don't need any connection when it comes to municipal water. Our wetland purifies our water system to potable quality or drinking quality. And then net positive ecology, because we actually took a research trip for this project to the Okavango Delta in Botswana, which is arguably the most pristine wetland in the world, to study the interaction, obviously, between vernacular cultures and the landscape, as well as, you know, what actual species work and what don't. What's interesting about this project is we even kind of invented a new category of kind of like net zero food. So you've got a rooftop farm that generates all the food, kind of vegetable food that you need, and then aquaculture, which is the farming of fish within the wetland system itself. And there has been documented proof that the early cultures before the city was here actually lived off wetlands as their primary food structure. So harvesting things like freshwater mussels, which are most people don't know about, and indigenous fish species. And here's the formal accreditation from the Green Building Council of South Africa. This is what it looks like on the inside, nice and contemporary. And then our last project, which kind of links into what Brendon will be talking about, is our Park of Light along the Braamfontein-Spruit. The Braamfontein-Spruit are one of those north-flowing river systems that I mentioned that we want to kind of encourage to become wildlife corridors. This is us working with city parks and zoo. And the Braamfontein-Spruit is probably known as the longest longitudinal park in the world. And the Braamfontein-Spruit itself is the longest stream in Johannesburg. Spruit basically is the Afrikaans word for small river or stream. If you know Johannesburg, this is where our project is located. Delta Park is arguably the biggest park in the kind of the city's area. And we've kind of chosen a constricted space, what we've termed the nozzle, which is at the kind of intersection between Jan Smuts Avenue and Conrad Drive. Just zooming in a bit more, if you know the area, this is Old Park Sports Club. You've got Vega Art School, and you've got kind of these three different social economic groups coming together. You've got the Randburg area, which is a middle class area. Sandton is a wealthier area. And then you've got park dwellers or homeless that actually live within the park itself. This is just a couple of photos of what it looks like. Our scheme kind of starts with from a bridge. This is Jan Smuts, and goes to kind of a waterfall edge. And as you can see, the pylons themselves became quite an important inspiration from a form point of view for us in terms of our interventions. And pylons are quite unique things in Joburg. They've kept a lot of open space open because of the illegality of being able to build underneath them, which is quite interesting. Again, we've approached this living, the Ecology of Place imperative onto this project by looking at its original habitat. Generally, the grassland landscape of Johannesburg was very open. You've mainly only really had trees in what are called fire shadows, where fire couldn't get to. And that's generally on kind of certain koppie areas and along streams. Then in the early 1900s, you had kind of a formal European approach to the use of water within a city, of basically making it a canal for kind of recreation and outdoor festivity. So our project basically started with interviewing local people on site. This is Alfred Mkiza. He's been living in the park since 1989, so over 30 years. And he really became our hero for this project on, you know, really wanting to do urban farming. So he's a recycler, gets up at almost 2 o'clock in the morning, goes through our rubbish, makes a living from that in order to provide for his family. He's chosen to live in the park so that he can actually provide for his family that live in an informal settlement in Kailami. So most people think that the poorest of the poor actually live in informal settlements. They don't. Most are park dwellers, or what people term as homeless. And so this is a really important aspect that we miss. And obviously existing city policy doesn't have any provisions for dealing with someone that's lived in the park. And our argument is, if someone's lived there for 30 years, surely he must be one of the most important users of a space like that. So the first part of this scheme was to look at an ecological regeneration in terms of the river itself. That's our starting client, to restore the river into functionality, first by removing invasive species. There's a whole lot of invasive species like giant reed that needs removing, installing litter traps and litter catchment devices, and then third, starting to reintroduce endemic fish and plant species. So just to give you an idea, the streams around Johannesburg had about 14 different indigenous fish species. There's now 0. So we're kind of starting from a 0 point of view. Second aspect, as we know, as we start to restore ecological systems, they also help us when it comes to extreme weather events. So just things like sustainable urban drainage A lot of our hardscaped areas, the stormwater flows very, very quickly into our river systems that causes massive problems. So if we start to redesign these areas to be more ecologically resilient, we really start to help our own devices like stormwater management. This also has an important human relationship because people live underneath this bridge currently. This is the actual bridge in our scheme, and there have been people that have actually drowned from sleeping underneath this bridge. So we wanted to kind of change the usage of this space into something that could be used at night and discourage sleeping just because it's too dangerous. And so we designed an art gallery in collaboration with the Vega Art School to kind of exhibit their student work underneath the bridge. The core of this scheme, which Brendon will talk more about, is really the urban farm. And the idea is about producing high quality produce that can be sold to local restaurants. This area, Craig Hall, has amazing kind of local restaurants that attracts middle to upper class residents. And so what we've tried to do is build kind of a microeconomy around a public open space that brings together the homeless can get employed in this urban farm. The restaurants get produce that then attract the middle and upper class residents. And so you're getting an economic system that's producing income to actually self-maintain. When you presented this to city parks, we asked them for their most difficult problems, and they gave us homelessness and money to just maintain their parks. And so this was one of the ways that we felt we could actually do this. And then in the corner, you'll see the parking lot of Vega is basically open during the weekend. So we decided to use that as a future produce market that can also sell that produce to the local community. Another project in terms of this is where the name comes from, Park of Light. We've designed these lighting towers, if you'd call them, within the electricity pylons that change color depending on the surrounding air pollution. Air pollution is something that we don't really engage with because we don't really see it. But this monitors pollution from kind of your vehicular traffic, things like carbon monoxide, nitrous oxide, those sort of things, and it changes from kind of blue to red. And this is part of a global scheme driven by the World Green Building Council called Plant to Sensor, where via a cloud platform, you can actually put your data onto the cloud and you can actually monitor through cities globally of kind of air pollution, which is also a form of just keeping cities accountable. So this would be a freely available aspect for the city to actually manage their air pollution and where to kind of introduce mitigation measures. Another thing about our streams is the high toxicity of the water. Generally, most of our streams have been canaled at the source, which most of them have been kind of concreted over. And so because we've got pretty high water table, most of the water that's getting into these streams is basically raw sewage because of a lack of maintenance of inner city building sewage systems. So sewage is not that bad. It's bad for your health, but it's actually very nutritious for plants. But then you get the problem of being over-nutritious, of too much potassium and too much nitrogen that actually chokes out any other life. So we've got a water purification system that basically uses reverse osmosis and UV treatment, purifies the water to a degree that can actually hold things like fish species and start to create that kind of baseline ecological system that you saw at the beginning. And as I mentioned, the lights that are located within the pylons actually test surrounding air pollution measures via a solar system. Then the most controversial aspect of our scheme, we've introduced homeless sleeping pods for the homeless to sleep at night specifically. Obviously, the city is very against any kind of people living within a public space, because what that starts to do is change it from a public space to a private space. And they've had bad experiences with kind of land invasion, which is still a problem. But we really felt in the short term that you had to give people just, a space for them to be warm and be out the rain. Again, this is a temporary solution. We'd love these people to be employed within our urban farm and find permanent accommodation. But again, as you've seen with people like Alfred, they are there in the park for a very specific reason. And even social development has tried to give them housing, but they refuse to do it because they want to live in the space in which they are making an income. So yes, this is our urban park. And let me stop sharing and just thank you for your time and hand over to Brendon. Here's my contact details as a firm if you do want to get involved. Thanks again.
Thanks, Mark. That was absolutely fantastic. Mark and I had a chat previously around this project, and I'm very excited to hopefully be able to support that at some point. But I think today's presentations really, from my side, is just to share some of the practical experiences that we've had around urban agriculture in in Johannesburg. My background as an economist is around trying to create new economic environments and ecosystems, specifically focusing on upliftment and solving for inequality. And urban agriculture presents an interesting case study in that you're introducing a layer of economic activity that does not exist. Yes, people have home gardens and there's some activity that happens, but when we talk about urban agriculture and in our context, we talk about creating an ecosystem of economic activity that allows for the creation of job opportunities, reduction of inequality, positive environmental benefits, shorter supply chains, food farm to fork, and that sort of approach. So I really today is about a sort of like a case study around Johannesburg and where we see, or where at least I see urban agriculture within this context. So in 2017, a project was started called the Urban Agriculture Incubator. I was part of the founding team of this project. And the entire purpose here was to introduce urban farming into Johannesburg. And part of that was through developing young people, youth 18 to 35, historically the demographic that was least interested in farming. Whenever you speak to your traditional farmers and companies involved in traditional commercial farming, it's very difficult to get youth involved. Our specific target was youth as sort of the future custodians of agriculture. We focused on trying to incorporate a modern hydroponic technology, which allows us to farm without soil and allows us to farm in spaces that are different, rooftops, unused spaces, garages, you name it. And from this, we were looking to create new small farming businesses that would feed local communities and create jobs. Little farms running through these hydroponic systems, growing food for local people, and really creating an impact and introducing a new economy. But it didn't work at all. It was a failure. But I think as we've gone through a process of readjusting this, when we talk about fail, we rather talk about first attempt in learning. And so from this, we really took the learning and we tried to reposition what this was and what this meant. And so we relaunched the program in 2019, Urban Agriculture Initiative, really looking at moving beyond or reinventing what we had tried to do. We're still looking at unemployed youth. We're still looking at deploying modern technologies, but we rather focus on developing a supportive ecosystem and really going back to a more natural way of looking at things as an ecosystem perspective. How do the farms and the farmers interact with each other? How do they interact with markets? How do we support that? How do we coordinate that? How do they interact with the environment? And so taking a more of a holistic approach to it. And this change has really been quite phenomenal. So we focused on two key elements when it comes to urban agriculture. So the first, based on the notion of trying to create job opportunities, reducing inequality in the urban space, is really creating a commercial model for urban farming. This is moving beyond looking at urban farming as a social project or a food security project that requires some donation to maintain, but rather creating a truly sustainable, and sustainable in the true sense of people, planet, and profit, so that this can continue in perpetuity. And secondly is co-developing a sustainable food security model. So in this instance, going into that social space, but looking at how do we create a sustainable model for addressing food security issues. So firstly on our commercial model, so what do we do? Well, in the inner city of Johannesburg, we have 10 sites, 10 farms that we put up. And we have a commercial kitchen where we process our produce. These farms are typically on top of rooftops. Some of them are in some vacant parking lot. We have some in a seedling farm at the National School of Arts in Braamfontein. They run on hydroponic systems, 3,600 plant sites on a 300 square meter footprint. We harvest one of these farms every week, typically pulling off between 500 and 600 kgs of production depending on how efficient and effective the farms have been running. This is a picture of our seedling farm. So we have a 200,000 plant site seedling farm, which enables us to produce 30,000 seedlings a week on a 6 to 7 week cycle. These seedlings go into our farms, but we also use these seedlings to support other projects and urban farmers within the inner city. Again, speaking to us looking beyond just what is immediately within our sort of sphere, but looking at supporting the ecosystem of urban farmers. One of the biggest challenges in the Johannesburg space when it comes to urban farming is actually access to good quality and affordable seedlings. Very difficult to find a consistent supply of seedlings, and which was a big surprise to us and one of the big learnings that we had. We had to go and build our own one so that we can have a consistent supply of quality seedlings at affordable prices. And so we use this facility to support NGO projects at preferential rates so that they can get good quality seedlings as well in terms of their projects that they're running, and then into our own farms as well, so that we have a consistent supply. This is typically what one of our farms looks like. This year we're busy growing basil. This farm itself is sitting on Coronia Gardens in Berea, 8 stories up. Quite a track getting all this produce down because sometimes the lifts don't work, so that's always fun. But that's some of the joy of working in these urban spaces, that you get to do a good leg workout sometimes. This is a farm in Newtown. This is harvest day. I think this is 6:20 in the morning. We're busy harvesting spring onion. And that's the view from the top, overlooking the urban sprawl that is Johannesburg. And at 6:20 in the morning, that is the freshest spring onion you will find in the city. We're then packaging our produce into crates, which we take into our processing facility, where it's packaged for retail, as well as into local grocers and restaurants. We focus quite heavily on spring onion because it's a very nice crop and a very good price point for us, and we get great reception to that product. And this is us delivering our products across Johannesburg to our agro processor. Some of our product does end up on the shelves in some of the retailers under their store brand. Some of our product ends up in the northern suburbs with some of the independent grocers, and then some of our product, as I said, into restaurants around the city. And then we start all over again. Seedlings, the same day that we harvest is the same day we clean the farm and we replant, so that we have continuous production. And we try and never miss a day of grow. This is a new farm that we've just completed. This is on top of one of the malls in Morningside. This is a built-for-purpose farm, specifically to service the restaurants, the high-end restaurants within that space. So here, this produce literally, when it's ready, it goes straight from the farm 2 stores down into the restaurant and onto the plate of the customer. This is one of our farmers, Zandile Kumalo, originally from Sebokeng. So she's now the farmer operating the site. She's been at this now for 4 months, harvesting all of this production and sending it down into the restaurants. She does a lot of lettuce, as you can see. She also does, she's starting with her peppers, her tomatoes, and she's also busy doing experimental herbs. So if you look in the background there, you see that white tower. That's a new technology that we're testing that allows us to grow 900 plant site pocket tower. She's growing your edible flowers in that tower for the restaurants. And this is our model. We really look at trying to create a consolidated or a full value chain ecosystem when it comes to our urban farming activity. We backwards integrated right into the seedling farm. We have independent growers, just like you would have a contract in a normal commercial space, contract farming. We use that same model here, just on a smaller scale. Independent farm owners, farmers, they come onto our properties. onto our farms that we own. They get a farming contract. We deliver seedlings, and they deliver an end product. We take it into our agro-processing facility, into the markets, and then we pay our farmers for what they grew and what the markets provided to us. And then we look at the co-development of sustainable food security models. So this is starting to speak to a little bit around what we do in the food security space. So when lockdown hit in the Brendon Valley, part of Johannesburg, one of the areas that was very badly affected. So this is this used to be quite an industrial space historically, and now a low-income neighborhood. And these are families busy receiving food parcels within that Brendon Valley space. But one of the biggest challenges with food parcels is that they were high in calories, low in nutrition. So while they served a purpose at the time in order to combat hunger, as a longer term strategy and in terms of food security, what we actually were creating was a malnourishment crisis in that area because the lack of fresh produce and the lack of nutrients in those food packs, just full of starches. And so we started working with the community kitchens. So in Brendon Valley, there are about 6 community kitchens that feed the local community, and we started looking at how we could introduce fresh produce into those spaces. And what we are doing now is we are looking at employing, executing a food security model in that space, but really to transform those community kitchens and the households in that space into productive spaces. But beyond just being a handout, we look at how we can create an ecosystem of activity. And so what we have designed and we will be implementing very shortly is a model where backyard garden growers and the community kitchens that have access to parcels of land, they receive the inputs that they need to get going from us. They receive the training. We do 12 months of monitoring, evaluation, support that we provide to these households, and they grow for their own consumption. But a percentage of that production comes back into our ecosystem, and we take that production and we amalgamate it together with everyone else, with all the households, aggregate it, and we take that into our marketing channels, so that we can then generate revenue, which we use to purchase more seedlings, and we're able to purchase more inputs to provide back to the households and back into the space. And so this way, we're looking at trying to create a sustainable ecosystem of activity, as opposed to us just providing the inputs and stepping away and having to then come back and continuously pour resources into a community. Rather, let's look at how we create an ecosystem of activity. And this is very much in terms of what we talk about in the Park of Light and the work that Marc is doing. How do we create an ecosystem? And the ecosystem is really about how not just the individual farms and the individual households work, but how those individual households link with other households and other community projects. And together we create a basis of production and a basis of economic activity and a basis for really driving a systemic change, both in terms of poverty and inequality, but also in terms of the food system that we have, and how we introduce that into the built environment becomes so critically important. And it has that systemic effect. So what are the impact areas that we're looking to target? Well, in terms of the South African calculators or the South African targets, these are our key elements. So we look at economy, employment, environmental sustainability, transforming human settlements, and building safer communities. That's in the South African context. I prefer the SDG, the Sustainable Development Goals, as our sort of guiding light. So we're looking at 1, 8, 9, 11, 12, and 13. And all of these speak to the creation of a hyper-localized food system that is inclusive of both in the people that live in that space and the consumers and the stakeholders. And in terms of the climate component for us, what we are doing is we are reducing the carbon footprint of the food on a plate that comes from our farm versus the food that comes from a farm sitting 100 kilometers away or 200 kilometers away in some instances, or even worse, that is across an entire ocean. Fresh produce flown into our city, onto our retailer shelves. And that is a massive carbon footprint and a carbon cost. And so if we look at hyper-localizing those food systems, we're massively reducing the carbon footprint of that food. The way that you grow as well is able to create a massive impact around the water footprint. So the hydroponics that we use, it has an 80% reduction in actual water required to grow the crop. So it's very water conscious space. And introducing this greenery into such a built environment helps to create a sustainable and a more biodiverse city, which we think is quite a significant need in our urban built environment. Just psychologically introducing this sort of greenery and biodiversity and helps incredibly when you're stuck in grey buildings all day, especially in areas like the inner city, which is heavily built up, minimal green spaces. And some people, they never even leave the inner city because they simply can't afford to. So what are some of the lessons that we learned from working through this modeling and learning from the failures? So urban agriculture has extremes. You get the basic sort of, I develop a little patch of dirt and that is what I can do. And then on the other extreme, you get especially in your developed countries, New York, Paris, you get these massive urban farming behemoths that cost millions and millions of euros or dollars to establish. And what I believe is that it's actually a continuum. What you need to focus on is appropriate technology and appropriate approaches for what you're trying to achieve. It's not about having the biggest and brightest and flashiest car. It's about having the right one. And so it's a bit about navigating the distance between these extremes that you then find the sweet spot. We always start with the market and then apply the solution that you need to service that market. So one of the big problems with the original program was that a technology was deployed because it was an interesting and fun technology, but no market was ever developed. There was no realization that the technology couldn't actually grow produce to service the local market. The local market didn't want very high quality produce. They just wanted affordable produce. And so the technology didn't fit the market. And so we had to redesign who our market was, just in terms of the technology we had on hand. But what we should have done is we should have worked with the market first to understand what the market needs and understand how we service that market, and then develop and then deploy the appropriate technology. You cannot be all things. So sometimes in urban farming and urban agriculture, it's about being healthy, it's about nutritious, it's about affordable, it's climate, it's organic, it's a lot of things. And what we found is you need to focus on what your core thing is that you want to be. If it's about affordability, let that be the thing that you focus on first, and then you build around that. If it's about creating highly nutritious, high quality product, let that be the core, and then understand how the other components support that core. And it links back to, understanding the market. Make sure that you're feeding the market and understand what the market needs, and then you can fill into where that core competency lies. And this I borrow from the Living Futures thing. Originally, this slide says collaboration, but I found the scale jumping. I thought I'd better use, as it fits in with the theme and the framework that we have here. Scale jumping. Your building, your site is not an island. Finding ways to collaborate, to draw in multiple stakeholders and other sites to build an ecosystem is the only way that these urban agriculture activities can scale, and two, be sustainable. You need the power of community to de-risk these spaces. In terms, if we look at the idea of servicing local restaurants, you cannot be one farm and service a local restaurant. There's too much risk there for the restaurateur. if you have one bad harvest and you aren't able to deliver the lettuce, there's going to be a failing there and they're going to lose their business. And so you have to have a network and a community to de-risk your production, share knowledge and share understanding, and build resilience in that ecosystem so that there's the opportunity for scaling and for sustainability. I think on that, I will end. Thank you so much for the opportunity, and I hope that this has been beneficial around some of the practical experiences around urban agriculture within the Johannesburg space. And I look forward to any questions. Thank you.
Thanks, Brendon. That was awesome. I really enjoyed that. I tried to set up an urban farm a couple of years ago, and I wish I had your lessons learned, because I think we failed exactly for those reasons. That was super interesting. Thank you both to Marc and Brendon. I'm just going to talk a little bit about our upcoming events. So next month, we will have a webinar on all the Living Building Challenge projects in South Africa that are currently happening. And we are inviting some of the professionals that have worked on these projects to share with you what are the opportunities, what are the challenges, and how has the Living Building Challenge changed their way of working in South Africa. So that's the next month. I'm very excited about that one. Then in July, we're probably going to plan one on the Living Product Challenge. So similarly, there's a system for products, building materials that could be a living building material. So I'm going to organize a webinar around that. And in August, we are going to have a topic which is also quite close to my heart, and that's integrating biophilia in architectural design. So those ones are planned for the coming month. You can start registering for the next month. It's open for registration, and we'll share all the links in the chat box just now. So again, it's time to create a living future in a world full of living buildings. And again, if you didn't hear me saying it earlier, if you want to have a presentation on Living Building Challenge, you want to learn a bit more about that certification system and the efficacy and the philosophy that goes behind it, we've got 4 ambassadors in the country, and we are happy to share our knowledge with you. So just drop us an email and be in touch with us. So where can you find us? Here are our details: lbccollaborative.rsa@gmail.com, and you can also follow us on Facebook and LinkedIn. I want to really thank EcoSolv for sponsoring this event and making it possible to provide you guys with CPD points and making this webinar available for free to you all. We really appreciate your financial contribution. Thank you to our speakers, Marc and Brendon. I really genuinely enjoyed both your presentations so much. So I think it was really a great webinar with good content and very good local content for South Africa.
Thanks, Marluz. Thank you very much. And indeed, those were great presentations, Marc and Brendon. And, you know, one must say that with questions being like pickaxes, the research and design questions unearth the potential solutions. And arguably, one cannot use technological solutions for political problems, but one must be daring, you know, to pole vault the landmines that the land and nature question is riddled with, especially when the history is being rewritten. So the aim of our sessions is that you are informed and inspired, and we hope we manage to achieve that today. Now, we'd like to encourage you to become a Living Future accredited professional and maybe see it as a way of adding to your innovation playbook. So the courses include an introduction to biophilic design, zero energy buildings, urban agriculture and community food systems, etc. And the LFA, this Living Future accreditation, requires 20 foundational points and 16 additional points. And we're soon going to provide locally contextualized courses to cover the 16 additional courses. So we urge you to consider this year and do your Living Future accreditation. If you want more information, there's the link or address there, but also you can just contact us and we'll give you more information. Thanks. Over to you, Marluz.
Thanks, Tulani. That's going to be very exciting for me to create this content for those LFA courses. And with that, I'm going to thank everyone for attending, for registrations. It's been amazing, and it's really good to see that we're providing value to you guys and that the registrations keep on climbing and climbing, and we really hope that we can make a difference in this industry and with our topic. So also, if you have any requests for particular topics related to sustainable and living buildings, just drop us a note and we'll put it on the agenda. So with that, again, thank you to our sponsor, thank you to our speakers, and I'd like to wish you all a very good evening and see you next month at the next webinar. Thank you all.